Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
That is why I challenge you now to stand together, raise your fists together, and engage in our national black litany. Do it with courage and determination. I am somebody. I am somebody. I may be poor, but I am somebody. I may be on welfare, but I am somebody. I may be unskilled, but I am somebody. I am black, beautiful, proud. I must be respected. I must be protected. What time is it? When we stand together, what time is it? When we say no more yes about, what time is it? What time is it? What time is it? Sister Kim Weston, the Black National Anthem.
This is the Green and Red Podcast. You were just listening to the late Reverend Jesse Jackson giving a speech at Watts Stax in 1972 in the LA Coliseum. This is a special Green and Red episode to pay tribute to Reverend Jackson. And, Jesse Jackson died today, civil rights giant. He died today at the age of 84. He's very known for his civil rights work. He's very known for being part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. He was at the Lorraine Motel when King was shot in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968. But we're going to talk more about Jesse Jackson and get a little bit deeper into his life and some of his work.
Yeah, I think most people know a little bit about him. Born in South Carolina, went to the University of Illinois to play football, then went back to North Carolina A&T. When the civil rights movement was emerging, he wasn't really deeply involved in it. He wasn't in any groups like SNCC early on, but then later he got affiliated with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He'd gone to divinity school. He was a minister, and then headed back to Chicago in the mid-'60s, where he began to work with the SCLC's Operation Breadbasket, which is a program to feed poor communities, and then helped create a group called PUSH, People United to Save Humanity. Was also involved with the mainstream civil rights movement. As you just pointed out, he was in Memphis in 1968. There are pictures of him on the balcony at the Lorraine Motel when King was assassinated. And after that, moved to Chicago and kind of created his own base based on these larger ideas. The media today, in all the obituaries all over, always referred to him as a civil rights leader and talked about black politics, and that's obviously a huge part of it. But I think like King, it was bigger than that, and that's something I think we're talking about, right? For instance, that clip comes from 1972. Jackson was going around the country talking to, especially African-American communities, but others as well, trying to kind of create, and in the North as well. And when he went to the University of Illinois, he said kind of the same thing King said when he went to Chicago, that he saw different intensities of racism there than he'd even seen in the South. Like, he went up to Illinois and a lot of people were calling him the N-word and things like that, right? And so he's going around the country trying to kind of, and the speech at Watts Stax, it was the record company Stax Records out of Memphis, was putting on his version of kind of a Woodstock, right? And he opened that, and he was going around the country doing a lot of that. And it was a message of kind of hope and uplift. I am somebody. There's a great clip, if you get a chance to see it, from, he was on Sesame Street with the kids, right? And it's very touching, right? So by the 70s, he was pretty well known as this kind of, obviously, I don't know if you call him he's a civil rights leader. Yes, you do, but almost like a protest leader, kind of offering an alternative vision. And this is the era, and this is, I think, really what's important for the next, like from 1972 through, like for about 20 years, right? He's offering a different version, an alternative version, as the Democratic Party is abandoning much of what it had stood for prior to that time. 1972 is a really pivotal year. We've talked about that before. And Jackson, I think, emerges from that. He's kind of a minister without portfolio. He held no political office or anything like that. We'll obviously get to, when he does run. First time he ever ran for office was as president of the United States, right? So he's really important, I think, from that period, starting around like 1970-ish, late 60s, early 70s, through, especially the next 20 or so years. And, I think, we've talked before, the Democratic Party was clearly moving away from its historical reputation, or let's call it at least its post-New Deal reputation by the late 70s, right? You have Jimmy Carter and neoliberalism, and Carter gets destroyed in 1980, and you have Reagan. And in many ways, wouldn't you say Jackson is kind of one of the last, I think, kind of champions of the New Deal order, the actual like Roosevelt New Deal?
Definitely think that. I mean, like you said, like you can't, Jesse Jackson as a civil rights leader is obviously a big part of it, but like I very much affiliate him with like this message of economic justice. Same with King. When you, as we have done many times on the show, when you dig in deeper with King, you saw that King was a democratic socialist. And I don't know if anyone's ever said that about Jesse Jackson, but he definitely, the politics around economic justice with Push and with the Rainbow Coalition, it was a message, and it was a politic around like equality for all, not just for Black people, not just for white people, not for just wealthy white people. I was listening to like one sort of obituary show about him today, and there was this, I actually think it was a clip that Bernie Sanders was actually, there was a tribute that Sanders paid for him in 2024. And it's a picture of him standing on a hay bale in Iowa and like during the 1988 presidential campaign. And he's surrounded by a bunch of white farmers talking about how this economy and culture of like white farming was being destroyed by Reagan and corporate agriculture and things like that. And that was a lot of like what I affiliate with Jackson. It's like this sort of economic justice message. It's very powerful, very important piece of it. It wasn't just what a lot of democratic politics has devolved into now is like just around identity politics. It also has a very strong sort of economic message.
Yeah. And I mean, he was active in politics. He campaigned for Jimmy Carter in 1976, 1980. And, saw him. And one of the first people, I think, to see where the Democratic Party was headed. They won in 1976. Although remember, this is only 2 years after Watergate, and Carter barely won. And by 1980, only 4 years later, he's destroyed. And the Democrats' message from all that, really from 1972, was that, somehow, it's what we're hearing today, right? Somehow they look at themselves and say, we've gone too far to the left, right? In a lot of ways, this is kind of where, like, you see the real emergence of identity politics too, where instead of dealing with issues like class or poverty or wages or employment or whatever, you see the Democrats break into these various groups, and they expect loyalty from these groups. And it could be Blacks, it could be Latinos, it could be women, it could be gays or whoever, right? Transgender people, could be anybody, right? And we still see that today, which is why I think it's important. And I think Jackson understood that that wasn't really a good idea, right? Ironically, right? He's African-American, who kind of is who the Democrats are angling toward. And he's the guy who's saying, wait, it's bigger than this, right? And that led to him on his own to decide to run for president. And he did that. Everyone said it's his ego. I mean, Jesse Jackson has plenty of detractors. No reason to talk about that right now. But a lot of people said it's his ego. He's a narcissist, all that kind of stuff. But I also think he understood where the Democrats were headed. And I think he offered them a lifeline. And of course, they rejected it. He, in 1983, announced he was running for president. I was actually in grad school at Ohio State. And that day he announced, I think he was in Flint, Cleveland, and Columbus. So I was in the crowd at Ohio State when he announced he was running for president. It's like incredible enthusiasm. And like, you just felt an energy. It's the only time in my life I've ever been enthused about like real politics. It's one of the few times in my life I've ever voted. I won, I'm a grad student. I think I gave him $20, to run, and, I campaigned for him and all that kind of stuff. Right. And beginning in 1983, the media didn't take him seriously. They came out with all these smears. A lot of it is based on race. He's anti-Semitic, right? He's associated with Louis Farrakhan. And yet the striking thing about that is he did pretty well,
Yeah. I mean, there was I mean, he definitely took up the progressive mantle. Like, I mean, the other thing to think about here too is that, like, one, the Democrats basically started trying to destroy themselves internally, at least the left, punching left. That's what we call it. That's what we call it here, Green and Red podcast, Green and Red.
I would say
Pun-
no one got punched more than Jesse Jackson.
Right, right. But it really kicks off in 1972,
Yeah.
and then in '84, after the Democrats are decimated by Reagan. I mean, I think they lose every state but Minnesota, correct?
Minnesota.
You know, and DC. But even though Jackson wasn't a candidate, they still like punch up on Jesse Jackson and this sort of more progressive agenda. Washington, who was a black mayor of Chicago, actually also falls into this as well. And that's also when the Democratic Leadership Conference is formed, which becomes the sort of embodiment of that punching left, in my opinion, which runs through 2011. And it's always about how to get the centrist elected, to get those with who the corporate sponsors like elected. And, that's, Jackson is more with the people, and, that sort of plays out from there. And we can get into the 1988 presidential campaign as well. And maybe we'll save this for a little bit later, but it's also important to note during this period, there's a lot of international solidarity work that's happening. And like particularly around apartheid in South Africa, Jackson was like a big part of that as well. Like he brought that sort of international solidarity element into into this progressive agenda that he kept continuing to champion through the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, the DLC I think is worth mentioning again because that's really important. I mean, the groundwork was already there for the DLC. There had been, in 1972, Jimmy Carter and Scoop Jackson at the Democratic Convention actually tried to rally the delegates to not give the nomination to George McGovern. And this is at the convention already, right? So that had already been out there. That the party has moved too far to the left. And then you have Carter and neoliberalism, the end of regulation. And so you have and especially by 1980, right? With Reagan's victory, the message that comes out of that. I remember people like Bill Clinton and Al Gore and I think Gephardt, maybe Gary Hart, we're all part of the DLC. Clinton is a big part of it, and he's kind of the benefactor of it, but it's bigger than that. And the message from the DLC is like, we've done too much to identify with working people and blacks and women, and we need to be nicer to Wall Street and corporations and all these big businesses. And Jackson's campaign, the success, and that's the important part of all this, is the success of Jackson's campaign, right? That forces their hand, right? They see the writing on the wall that there is still an audience that wants to hear and believes in these programs, believes in the message in the programs, right? Because Jackson, clearly he's talking about race, right? And he's talking about the differences in, poverty rates among blacks and whites and education and so forth. But he's, like you pointed out, I think it's really important. Like he goes to Iowa and does really well in the Iowa caucuses, like it kind of shocks everybody and the media finds a million ways to excuse it. But the fact is he was the only candidate talking to poor people. It's like King's Poor People's Campaign. And remember, he was part of that. He understood what that was about. So the media always, portrayed him in these very stark black and white terms, both real and metaphorical. And Jackson wouldn't do that. He moved beyond that. He stepped out of that. And he was in, Ohio. He was talking to steel workers. This is only 5, 6 years after the mills began to shut down. He's going to Pittsburgh. He's going to Gary. He's going to Detroit. And in 1988, that's really going to pay off, right? But I think the DLC, I'm not going to say it was created because of Jesse Jackson, but I think that pushed it over the finish line, right? They realized like, we got to have to do something because there's too much of this that's still out there and we have to get rid of it now, right? The Democratic Party has always put up these bogus ideas about electability, and that was Jackson's. You can't elect a black man president, right? Why? Because we said so. Why? Because you can't, right? It becomes this tautological argument, right? And they were, I think, really afraid that, in fact, Jackson's message was getting through. And you did have white voters, especially in industrial areas. And then, like in the 88 campaign, he actually won a bunch of Southern primaries, which had, significant levels of black voters as well. But I think, the DLC, and when we look back on the history of this era, I think the creation of the DLC is really important. I mean, there's a lot of people who talk about the origins of the new right in the 70s, right, in the 60s and 70s. And the best known is probably Rick Perlstein, And Pearlstein focuses on things like race and the culture wars, which are real, but he doesn't talk about the economy and the structures of poverty and working class people and deindustrialization as much as he talks about things like race and the so-called culture wars. Jackson understood that way better, way better. And I think that terrified the leaders of the Democratic, well, all the leaders, but especially the Democratic Party, who didn't want to give up power. There's a famous story, I can't remember where it came from, where, in 1968, when the Democratic Convention just literally exploded in Chicago, if you look at pictures of the delegates, there are a bunch of people who look like Richard Daley, old fat white men in suits, right? And then in 1972, the Democratic Convention, because they had new rules, I believe it was in Miami that year, there's a picture of Jesse Jackson on the floor wearing a dashiki, right? The Democratic Party had changed, and the old guard was furious, and they were going to make him pay for it. And I mean, eventually they did, right? But, and I think the DLC, you got to think about that. The Democrats essentially, it was self-destructive. Could talk all we want. Nobody will vote for them. They went too far to the left. They couldn't be elected, but they did it to themselves. They did it to themselves.
It's important to note in 1988, which is just a couple years after the DLC is formed, Jackson, he got 7 million votes as a presidential candidate, which actually was some of the other also rans that year were Al Gore and Joe Biden and Richard Gephardt. He got more votes than all of them combined. So I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, Dukakis, and then who was this? Was it? I forget.
Dukakis won, and Jackson came in second.
Yeah, and the biggest kind of fuck you to the Democrats was in the Michigan primary.
Yeah,
Jackson won the Michigan primary, and he won that with the votes of white steelworkers and people who had lost their jobs and kind of disaffected industrial workers, right? And not just black voters, right? Jackson won in Michigan. That was and remember, going back, he called it the Rainbow Coalition, 1984, right? Meaning, and again, it wasn't just a black, it was Rainbow Coalition, this is before we associated with like the gay rights movement, right? Actually, who was it? The Black Panthers, I believe.
Fred Hampton
Fred Hampton called it the Rainbow Conspiracy, right.
I thought Fred Hampton called it the Rainbow Coalition too.
Was it the coalition? Someone was calling it the Rainbow Conspiracy before that. But the point is their idea there is that, everybody gets together under this banner of being kind of exploited and working. It's the poor people's campaign. It's exactly what King was trying to do too, right? So when the media says civil rights leader, this, that, black leader, like, oh, it's way more than that, which is why they do it. I saw years ago, I don't even remember. It was an interview with Jesse Jackson and maybe Skip Gates, doesn't matter. And they were talking about American politics, and Jackson said, and this came up exactly, the idea of class, and Jackson and Skip Gates, I believe, said, something about like, you tend to make an appeal bigger than just race, right? More than just the black community. And Jackson said, as much as Americans don't like to talk about race, they ignore race, they ignore class even more. Mm-hmm. That's a paraphrase, but that's kind of what he meant, right? That is what he meant, right?
Right.
And that, I think, is what really scared. It's kind of going back to the populists in the 1890s, right? Or elements of the CIO in the 1930s, or.
I mean, I think it's also important to note that this is the era of Reagan. And so it's like an anti-union period. It's an anti-progressive period. It's an anti-civil rights period. It's where Reagan is trying to roll things back. John Roberts, who's now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was in the Civil Rights Division under Reagan, trying to figure out how to undo the Voting Rights Act. That it's very important. That's also a very reactionary period. And like Jackson is holding his ground on this, economic justice, progressive agenda, whatever you want to call it.
I mean, I would say he's the main resistance to Reagan in the 80s. I mean, wasn't Tip O'Neill, it wasn't Sam Nunn, I would say it was Jesse. Like I said, he's a minister without portfolio in a lot of ways, but I remember in the 80s, what struck me is how many people.
No big union leaders, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, half of them endorsed Reagan, right? Like the Teamsters today, right? I can't tell you how many people, like in Ohio, at the time, in this area, like the Youngstown area, has been destroyed. It's been wiped out, right? How many white guys who either like were hanging on to the last factory jobs or who had lost their jobs in the factory supported Jesse Jackson? I mean, these are guys I grew up with, guys who, I went to school with, guys in my family who were not the most like, kind of like openly liberated, racially sensitive people, right? And all of them, said, he's the only guy who stands up for us. He's the only one I hear talking about us.
Right. Did he win Ohio? Do you know in 84 or 88?
I doubt, no, I'm sure he didn't. But there, I mean, at the time you had a base, and especially in places like Cleveland, you did very well, right?
Right.
And it was funny because I remember at the time, you did have elected black officials like Harold Washington, you mentioned earlier, and the media just like went to such great lengths to dissociate these people from Jesse Jackson. So it was always like, oh, Jesse Jackson's a loudmouth, but what's he ever done? Look at Harold Washington, as if they fucking like Harold Washington, right? But they would always use that, right? But the 88 campaign, I think, is really crucial. And, it really scared the Democrats even more. And, they ran one of the worst candidates ever who ran one of the worst, in 1984, 1980.
Speaking of mediocre campaigns.
Well, no, I was like, in 1980, Jimmy Carter ran the worst campaign ever. In 1984, oh my God, you can't do worse than Mondale. Dukakis in 88, Gore, that Kerry, Clinton, Perry, like, but I really think that 88 campaign and the success, and that's it, the success, the popularity. And Jesse Jackson came across as sincere, right? He when he was holding a kid or talking to some poor people or talking to an old person in a wheelchair, you felt like he really did give a shit,
Yeah.
And
I mean, I guess that's what Bill Clinton did, is he was able to fake that.
Oh, Clinton was
the sincerity.
Once you fake sincerity, you got it made, man.
Yeah. There you go.
Oh, go ahead.
Do we want to touch on the international solidarity?
Yeah,
stuff?
I was just going to say because that's a really crucial part of this too, which also really pisses off the establishment.
Yeah, and also it's important to contrast this with the international solidarity stuff with the progressives today, and the sort of, speaking of fake sincerity as far as like international issues go. But like I think it's
you're not referring to AOC, I hope,
or Bernie,
referring.
I mean, I just want to be like, just to be real, is that like, it definitely coming out of this sort of like this post 60s new left period where, a big part of the movement definitely has a lot of like what's called anti-imperialist politics. But like, Jesse very much, like I said before, is like, he very much ingratiates himself with the anti-apartheid movement. We have, Reagan is, buddying up with the apartheid regime in South Africa, while, Jesse's in the streets, going to jail with people who are trying to get companies to drop business with, the apartheid regime, trying to get the government to move on, to act on apartheid.
I believe in 86 was when the arrests at the embassy began. He was the first one. I remember it was like a huge news story. I was living in DC at the time, and he had gone to the embassy and just walked in and refused to leave. And began that kind of sit-in, kind of arrest the movement, sit-in movement at the embassy. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I just think, we should even maybe someday do a show on the history of the anti-apartheid movement. I feel like it was like a pivotal moment for a lot of people, but, Jackson was in solidarity with Nelson Mandela. He was in solidarity with the ANC, and it's, you don't really see any sort of mainstream progressive really kind of taking a position like that. I think that's actually pretty important. He was also in solidarity with the Palestinians, right? That's definitely like a third rail issue these days. And so it's very important. And then there's also where he was like, you see images of him with like Fidel, you see images of him with Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. And these are all places where the U.S. is actively supporting, war and violence against these, people in Palestine, people in Nicaragua, people in South Africa.
In the 84 campaign, he went to Cuba.
And the 84 campaign.
The coolest part of that was like, he didn't apologize and he didn't recant, right? He went on humanitarian missions. He got a downed American flyer. Was that in Syria?
It was in Beirut. It was in Lebanon.
It was in Lebanon.
Robert Goodman.
And then escorted him to the White House, and Reagan had to look at Jesse Jackson, who got this guy freed right from captivity. The support of Palestinians, I remember, was just, it's still today, I've been involved in like kind of Palestinian solidarity for decades, and Jesse Jackson has a good name in those circles for what he did. I mean, in the 80s, nobody in American politics would go near Palestine. And he did it. He supported the Sandinistas. He was active in the anti-nuclear, the no nukes movement. Just, I really think in a lot of ways he was kind of, I don't want to get like melodramatic, the last of this or the last of that, but there was something going on there that you haven't seen since then, really.
I heard one commentator today talk about how he was a bridge to the civil rights generation and to the Black Power era, and I do think that's somewhat important to note too. I feel like there's a lot of youth who are out on the streets around Gaza, around what happened in Gaza, around Black Lives Matter and things like that. And Jesse, engaged with those folks. And last year, he actually joined a boycott of Target over DEI programs. Apparently, he was too sick to really have
Yeah.
anything to say about what's been happening even more recently with Trump and ICE and things. But he would have been out in the streets if he could have been.
Yeah, and now he's, everything gets commodified, right? And so now it's like, Black History Month, where we are right. Jesse Jackson will be on like a mural with people, but the first presidential candidate. But like I think it's like King, right? Where that's why we do these shows on King, the radicalism of Martin Luther King. There was more to Jesse Jackson than that, right? And he's flawed, like everybody else, and he had his detractors, like everybody else. But he stood up. You mentioned the Palestinian thing. I mean, he was attacked. Apparently, off the record, he made some comments in
Oh
about
yeah, I
the
forgot to
Jewish
bring
community.
that. I forgot to bring that up.
Yeah, the Jewish community in New York, and he was attacked and vilified for that.
By the mayor of New
And
York.
yeah, but at Koch, right? And so he just kind of he took all those arrows, right, and got fought through it. In 1992, there was a lot of speculation that he'd run again, but he didn't. And unfortunately, I think in retrospect, I could say unfortunately, that was kind of the ultimate triumph of the DLC and this kind of democratic movement, with Bill Clinton, which was kind of warmed over Reagan. Clinton was kind of Reagan without the really ugly, sharpened fangs, but you get things like the welfare reform and
Slick Reagan. He was like Slick Reagan.
yeah, slick Reagan, the Crime Act, and all that kind of stuff, right? And deregulation, what do you call it, repeal Glass-Steagall. So Jackson clearly, lost that big battle, which was kind of inevitable anyway. But
There was a notable event in the '92 campaign where Clinton gave a speech calling out a rapper, Sister Souljah, because she had said something about blacks in LA going to shoot white people instead of other
yeah,
blacks. He actually made that speech with Jackson on stage, I believe. And am I wrong?
I don't know.
I think Jackson was sitting there on stage with him, and it's a politically calculated move to basically distance themselves from like the sort of like progressive black agenda, in my opinion.
Yeah. Oh, you mean by Clinton?
Yeah, by Clinton.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I didn't realize Jesse was on the,
I think he was. I'm pretty sure he was.
but yeah, that I think Clinton. It's always struck me like Toni Morrison called Clinton the first black president. I never understood that because he and his wife, they were the people who called them super predators. They created these, welfare and crime bills that disproportionately affected young blacks. You have this kind of hyper incarceration during the Clinton years. You have the disparity in crack and powder cocaine sentencing, right? And so the idea that Bill Clinton somehow responded to the black community, I always found like just disturbing, But Jesse Jackson, it's hard to look at somebody who, really did operate in kind of an electoral politics realm, but Jackson, I think, was so much more than that.
Clinton made those comments at a Rainbow Coalition event.
Oh, okay. I got to say, I had one brief experience with Jesse Jackson. He had a radio show. And in 2017, I don't know why I was doing a bunch of radio about Hurricane Harvey in Houston, because Houston got pelted because it was like so overdeveloped. And I don't know how, but like somehow his radio show got my name and it was cool. I got to talk to Jesse Jackson for about 10 minutes about Hurricane Harvey and development in Houston. And, I called it cowboy capitalism. He really liked that name. But for the next week, I wouldn't shut up. People were just sick of me because I kept saying like, I was interviewed by Jesse Jackson. I talked to Jesse Jackson. So finally, I think I got, okay, you've heard enough. But everybody I talked to was like, did you know I talked to Jesse Jackson?
In my very young days of doing politics in the mid '90s, I went to Ross Perot's We the People convention in Dallas, and Jesse Jackson was there, and I sort of like was walking through the halls and bumped into his entourage, which he was a huge guy too. He was a big guy.
Well, he went to college. He was gonna played football at the University of Illinois. I believe, and I don't quote me on this, I'm not sure if it's correct, but I think he was a quarterback. And in the early 60s, black guys weren't allowed to be quarterback. So I think part of it was like they were going to make him like play a different position or something like that. But I may be conflating something else. But just, just seemed like a cool guy. One of my best friends named his son after him, who was my son Kelsey's friend, so he meant a lot to us. He really did. And, I can look back and, it's a fairly bleak time, right? But, there were moments when we, as he would always say, keep hope alive, right? And,
Yeah,
it's
totally.
frustrating today, like AOC, who I think just stumbled through this talk in Munich, and to see these left maggot, like Jacobin is now like going nuts about how amazing AOC is and how great she was. And just, that's sad to me. Like what we have today, it's not what Jackson was doing 40 years ago, 30 years ago.
That's what I'm saying is that there's this false sincerity. And honestly, I still think at least center right politics around a lot of the progressives in Congress, like not Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar, but like many of the others who identify as progressives still have, politics where they're like, it was good that we took Maduro out, or, Israel has a right to defend itself. And
AOC was pimping for NATO and Ukraine weaponization,
yeah,
it's grotesque. And Sanders won't say anything about, won't use the word genocide. And yet every time he says something about Venezuela, he has to talk about Chavez and Maduro and use the word dictator, just like AOC didn't. Whatever. But the point is, like, it's Jackson was unapologetic when he went to Cuba, when he talked to Arafat, when he defended the ANC, which was being labeled a communist and terrorist. Remember, the ALC the ANC was considered a terrorist group. Mandela was on the terrorist list until I forget in the 2000s, and Jackson didn't really flinch from that. He had his flaws, and there are moments when he didn't live up to those ideals like everybody else. But for the most part, he took a lot of arrows. And
what you're saying? He's not a genius. He's not a saint. He's a genius.
He's not a saint. He's a genius, not a saint, right?
He's a genius, not a saint. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's not a saint, but the guy, like, he took a lot of arrows, and he meant a lot. And he said keep up alive, which is harder and harder to do. And I'm sure, like he would be saying that now if he had been able to at the end, right? But
we have a much more robust, revitalized progressive movement in many ways right now, despite our critiques of the flaws of the leadership. And I actually think Jackson is partially responsible for that. Like like I called him a bridge a minute ago, but he in many ways is a bridge from like an earlier era to like what we're seeing now. And I think that's important. Like, 42% of self-described Democrats identify as socialists. So, part of that's because of what Jesse Jackson did like 30, 40 years ago.
Well, I would think anyone who's, let's say, your age and older probably has some part of Jesse Jackson in his or her background.
Yep.
It had to probably mean something, right? Because you were like what in your?
I was 18. I was 18, going on 19 in the 88 presidential.
Okay, so you're old enough, right? So anybody, I would say of your generation, surely my generation, because I'm older than you, right? If you're part of that, then there's part of you that remembers that, and there's probably something that happened back then involving Jesse Jackson that stuck with you. I know, I've told you many times that, like the Central American movement in the 80s really kind of was what kind of made me lose it, made me go nuts, right?
Yeah.
But Jackson campaign was a big part of that. It really was, both in 84 and 88. They're the only 2 times in my life I've kind of given a shit about like a presidential campaign. And because I saw something bigger in it, and I think a lot of people in Minneapolis and in LA and in Chicago and all over, a lot of the older folks. See, that's one thing that's very cool. You're seeing this really diverse group right now in the streets, not just like culturally or ethnically or gender, but in terms of age groups too. There's a lot of old people. There's a lot of people older than me in the streets of Minneapolis, carrying whistles around and getting in the faces of ICE Nazis,
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that, they probably remember what it was like in the 70s and 80s, and probably remember Jackson,
Yeah, totally.
Jesse Jackson, Presente.
Yep. Presente. Folks, you've been listening to the Green and Red podcast. Please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky. If you're watching us on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to this on an audio platform, give us a rate and review. If you really like us, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And until next time, make trouble and misbehave.